February 25, 1957. In a wooded area on the outskirts of Philadelphia, a man discovers a small cardboard box, discarded, weathered, and strange. Inside lies the body of a young boy. No name, no clothing, no one searching for him. For decades, he would be known only as America's unknown child, but 65 years later, science would finally give him a name and a story that's both heartbreaking and haunting. This is the mystery of the boy in the box. The wind was sharp that February afternoon in 1957, the kind that bites through your coat and stings your fingers no matter how tightly you clutch them in your pockets. On a quiet stretch of Susquehanna Road, in the Fox Chase area of northeast Philadelphia, a young man made his way through the tangled underbrush. He wasn't there for anything unusual, just checking his muskrat traps, something he'd done many times before. But as he moved through the woods, something caught his eye, something that didn't belong. A cardboard box, propped against a thicket of trees, its edges softened by damp weather. At first glance, it looked like trash. Philadelphia's outskirts were littered with debris even then. Old furniture, tires, scraps that people dumped where no one would see. He approached, hesitated for a moment, then pried open the flaps. Inside was a small blanket, faded plaid folded over something, and beneath that, the tiny, lifeless body of a young boy. He froze. For a long moment he couldn't breathe. The child was naked, bruised and pale, his small body positioned as if he had been carefully placed there. His eyes were closed, his lips slightly parted. Someone had cut his hair unevenly, as though trying to disguise him. The man panicked. He covered the box again and hurried away. Strangely, he didn't report what he'd seen right away, perhaps out of fear or disbelief or simply shock. It wasn't until days later that another man, curious about the same discarded box, opened it and made the official call to police. What followed was a scene of quiet horror. Philadelphia police arrived quickly, along with the medical examiner and a handful of reporters who had caught wind of the discovery. The woods were eerily still except for the crunch of boots over the frozen earth. Detectives marked off the small patch of ground, setting down their evidence tags, their cameras clicking through the cold air. The box was identified as one used to ship a J.C. Penney baby bassinet sold from a store less than 20 miles away. Inside it lay a thin blanket, worn and frayed at the edges. And the small boy? He was estimated to be between 3 and 7 years old, though his frail frame made it hard to tell. He weighed only about 30 pounds. His ribs showed clearly beneath his skin. He had blue eyes, light brown hair, and features that might have been beautiful if not for the bruises. There were signs of prolonged neglect, scars across his body, old injuries that had healed unevenly, and small bruises on his arms and legs. His hair appeared freshly cut, tufts of it clinging to his shoulders and the blanket, as if someone had tried to alter his appearance after death. The medical examiner noted that he had been recently bathed. His nails were clean. Someone had cared enough to tidy him, yet not enough to save him. The autopsy revealed that the boy had suffered from blunt force trauma to the head. He had also endured several other injuries that told a story of long-term abuse. The official cause of death was homicide. But there was no identification, no clothing, no personal effects. Nothing that said who he was, or where he'd come from, or who might be missing him. The detectives gave him a temporary name in their notes: John Doe, white male, approximately 4 to 6 years old. But unofficially, around the station and in newspapers, he would soon become known as the boy in the box. The discovery rattled the city. Philadelphia wasn't unfamiliar with tragedy, but this was different. The image of the small beaten child found alone in the woods was almost too much to bear. Reporters described the case in hushed, reverent tones, their words filled with the kind of sorrow usually reserved for lost soldiers or saints. Police officers, hardened by years of grim work, couldn't shake the sight. Many said it was the saddest case they had ever seen. In the days that followed, the investigation mobilized with urgency. Photographs of the boy's face were taken in hopes someone might recognize him. The police even released post-mortem photos, carefully retouched to make him appear peaceful, almost sleeping. Flyers were printed by the thousands, distributed to every corner of Philadelphia and beyond. They were sent to orphanages, hospitals, schools, and churches. Mail carriers were given copies to share on their routes. Every missing child report across the country was checked and rechecked, but not a single match came back. No one had reported a missing boy fitting his description. No parents came forward to claim him. No neighbors recognized his face. It was as though he had appeared from nowhere, lived in silence, died in secret, and been discarded like something disposable. The medical examiner, Dr. Joseph Spellman, examined the body again, searching for clues. The boy's stomach was empty. His hands were small and delicate. He had a faint surgical scar on his ankle and another near his groin, suggesting he might have received medical treatment at some point. Those details were published in newspapers nationwide, but they led nowhere. With each passing day, the hope of identifying him dimmed. The press began to call him America Sits Unknown Child. The phrase captured what everyone felt, that he wasn't just one boy but a symbol of every lost, forgotten child who had fallen through the cracks. When it came time to bury him, there were no family members to mourn at the grave, no friends to leave flowers. Instead, police officers, tough men who had seen too much, stood by quietly as a small casket was lowered into the ground. The tombstone bore a simple inscription: "Heavenly Father, bless this unknown boy." For years, detectives would visit his grave on anniversaries. Some left toys or coins. Others whispered promises, vowing they wouldn't stop until they knew his name. But as the seasons passed, the leads dried up. The cardboard box was gone. The trail went cold. And the boy who had once lived, laughed, and been loved by someone vanished once again into mystery. In the days and weeks following the discovery, the investigation into the little boy's death consumed the Philadelphia Police Department. Every detective, every patrolman, every corner of the city seemed to echo the same question: who was he, and how could a child simply vanish from existence? They began with the evidence. The cardboard box had once contained a J.C. Penney baby bassinet, sold by a local store in Upper Darby. Investigators traced the serial number and tracked every unit sold in the region. But it was 1957. Cash transactions were the norm, receipts were rare, and record-keeping was far from precise. Hundreds of identical boxes had been purchased in the months before the discovery, and any one of them could have been the one used to conceal the boy's body. That lead, promising at first, went nowhere. The blanket found wrapped around the child was examined next. It was a simple, inexpensive cotton blanket with a distinctive blue and green plaid pattern. Detectives sent samples to textile experts across the country, hoping to trace its manufacturer or retailer, but again the results came back discouraging. Thousands of identical blankets were sold in the 1950s. Nothing about it was unique enough to narrow the search. The boy's body itself became both evidence and mystery. The medical examiner, Dr. Spellman, described him as severely malnourished. His small stomach was empty, his bones too visible. His feet and hands were clean, suggesting he had been washed, perhaps even prepared after death. The haircut appeared fresh. Whoever had done it seemed to have cut unevenly and hastily, leaving clumps of hair behind on the blanket. Was it an attempt to disguise him, or an act of care from someone who didn't know what else to do? The cause of death was clear: blunt force trauma to the head. The injury was consistent with a strike from a heavy object, though no weapon was ever found. He also bore multiple bruises in various stages of healing, evidence of ongoing abuse. Scars on his ankle and groin suggested that he had undergone medical treatment at some point in his short life, but no hospitals in the region could find matching records. Detectives worked tirelessly. They compared the boy's fingerprints, dental structure, and physical characteristics to missing children cases across all 48 states. Flyers with his image, carefully retouched to make him appear more lifelike, were mailed to every police department in the country. They sent photographs to orphanages, foster homes, schools, and churches. The story made national headlines, and yet no one recognized him. One of the more haunting aspects of the case was the complete absence of a missing persons report. For most children, someone notices: a parent, a teacher, a neighbor, but not this time. Not one report fit his description. It was as if this boy had lived entirely off the grid, unseen by the systems meant to protect him. That detail disturbed the detectives more than anything else. They canvassed the neighborhoods near the discovery site, knocking on doors, showing pictures, asking questions. Had anyone seen a child go missing? Had anyone noticed suspicious behavior? A few residents remembered a blue sedan parked along the road a few days earlier, but no one could describe the driver. Others claimed they had seen people dumping trash in the woods, not unusual for the time, but nothing they could connect to a child. The police even checked with traveling carnival workers and small circuses passing through the region, wondering if the boy might have been a performer's child, abandoned by transient parents. No leads emerged. Weeks turned into months. The city's newspapers dubbed the mystery "The Boy in the Box," and it quickly captured the public imagination. Donations poured in for the boy's burial. School children sent flowers. Yet despite the widespread attention, tips were sparse, and those that came in led nowhere. In the early 1960s, a psychic contacted police claiming to have visions of the boy's killer. Desperate for progress, detectives followed her guidance to a nearby foster home not far from where the body had been found. It was a strange coincidence. The foster home's property did include old bassinets and blankets, similar to those found with the boy. Investigators searched the grounds, questioned the owner, and examined every foster record, but the evidence didn't connect. The psychic's vision, though intriguing, yielded nothing concrete. The foster home theory was filed away unresolved. For a time, investigators turned to a new lead. Could the child have been an orphan from another state, transported and dumped far from where he lived? They checked with adoption agencies and welfare departments across the country. Again, nothing. In the following decades, detectives aged out of the force, but none ever forgot the case. It passed from one generation of investigators to the next, each hoping to be the one to solve it. Some kept photographs of the boy on their desks. Others visited his grave on their days off. The case became a quiet obsession within the department, a symbol of unfinished business. In the 1980s, forensic science had advanced just enough for new hope. Investigators exhumed the boy's body for the first time, taking tissue samples and reanalyzing evidence with updated techniques. They found no new leads, but the act itself renewed their commitment. They moved his remains to a more prominent resting place at Ivy Hill Cemetery, where the headstone would bear the inscription, "America's Unknown Child." Then in 2002, a woman known only by the pseudonym Martha came forward with a disturbing story. She claimed that her mother had purchased a young boy from his birth parents in the 1950s, kept him hidden in their basement, and eventually killed him during a violent outburst. Martha's details were chillingly accurate. She described the blanket, the haircut, and even the boy's small stature. She claimed her mother had bathed him before his death, then placed his body in a cardboard box and abandoned it. For a brief moment, detectives thought they might finally have the truth. They searched for corroborating evidence, property records, neighbors, family members who could confirm the story, but everything came up empty. The alleged home was gone, demolished decades earlier. No trace of the boy existed in any official record. In the end, Martha's story was deemed unverifiable. Another promising lead vanished into thin air. The years continued to roll on, and the mystery deepened. Amateur sleuths took up the case in online forums, forming communities devoted entirely to identifying the boy. Some theorized that he was the child of an unwed mother who had given birth in secret and abandoned him out of fear. Others speculated that he came from a wealthy family trying to hide a scandal. There were even theories involving kidnapping, trafficking, or illegal adoptions, but none of them could be proven. The most haunting aspect of all was that the boy had clearly been cared for, at least at some point. His fingernails were trimmed. He had been fed, clothed, and even treated for minor medical issues before his death. Someone had loved him enough to look after those details, but somewhere along the way that care turned into cruelty. By the turn of the millennium, the case had become a cold, almost mythic story, a piece of Philadelphia's dark folklore. Reporters still wrote about it every few years, hoping new attention might stir up an old memory, but nothing surfaced. The detectives who had once been young and ambitious were now retired, and most had gone to their graves without an answer. Still, the question lingered. How does a child vanish so completely that no one remembers him? How can a life so small, so precious, be erased without a trace? For nearly half a century, the boy in the box remained nameless. His image, the black and white photograph of a solemn little face framed by freshly cut hair, became both a haunting reminder and a promise. Somewhere, someone knew who he was. Somewhere, there was a family that had either forgotten or concealed him. Investigators never gave up that belief. They stored his evidence carefully, preserved every scrap, and passed the case file like a sacred relic from one detective to the next. They didn't know it yet, but the answers they sought would eventually come, not from another confession or an eyewitness, but from the smallest piece of evidence imaginable, a strand of DNA that had waited patiently for decades to speak the truth. By the late 2010s, the boy in the box case had become one of the oldest unsolved murders in American history. 60 years of searching, 60 years of unanswered questions, and still he had no name. But time has a way of changing what's possible. and science was about to do what decades of detective work could not. In 1998, long before DNA forensics became what it is today, investigators exhumed the boy's remains for the first time. They hoped to collect a small biological sample, maybe enough for genetic testing. The technology then was primitive by today's standards. But the detectives did it anyway, because they believed that one day, someone might be able to use that sample to find his identity. That act of foresight, of refusing to let him be forgotten, would later prove crucial. As DNA technology evolved through the early 2000s, other cold cases began to crumble under its precision. Long unsolved murders, rapes, and disappearances were suddenly being resolved with a single microscopic clue. By the mid-2010s, forensic genealogy had emerged, the technique that would change everything. Using public DNA databases and family trees, genealogists could identify distant relatives of an unknown person, then trace their ancestry backward to uncover the identity itself. This was the same breakthrough that caught the Golden State Killer decades after his crimes, and soon that same science would turn its gaze toward the little boy found in a cardboard box. In 2019, Philadelphia police partnered with genealogical experts who specialized in cold cases. They carefully exhumed the boy's body again, this time with more advanced extraction tools and a better understanding of how to work with degraded DNA. The remains were fragile, but the team succeeded in obtaining enough genetic material to begin analysis. That DNA was uploaded to national databases, GEDmatch and others used by genealogists to connect long-lost relatives. For months, specialists examined partial matches, building out family trees that sprawled across decades and generations. It was slow, tedious work, like piecing together a jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing. Every name they found led to another, each connection sparking hope. Still, it wasn't enough. The boy's ancestry appeared tangled and distant, but somewhere in that web his truth was waiting. Then, in late 2022, something shifted. The genealogists located a distant relative on the boy's maternal side. Using that single branch, they built an extensive family tree connecting names, birth records, and marriage certificates until they finally reached the generation that mattered. And there, hidden among decades of paper and silence, they found him. The boy in the box was Joseph Augustus Zarelli, born on January 13, 1953 in Philadelphia. 4 years old at the time of his death. For the first time in 65 years he was no longer an anonymous child. He had a name, a birthday, a family, and a place in history. When detectives saw his birth certificate for the first time, some of them cried. They had spent their entire careers chasing a ghost, and now that ghost finally had a voice. Police identified his parents as Mary Elizabeth Vaughn and Augustus Gus Zarelli, both deceased by the time of the discovery. Their lives had taken separate paths after Joseph's birth, and whatever circumstances surrounded his death remained shrouded in secrecy. Investigators have not publicly confirmed who was responsible for killing Joseph, but they believe that someone within his extended family still knows more than they've said. The announcement came on December 8, 2022, during a press conference at Philadelphia Police Headquarters. After decades of uncertainty, the city finally heard the name that had eluded it for generations. Standing before reporters, Police Commissioner Danielle Outlaw Sipp's voice carried both pride and sorrow. She said, "This child Sipp's story has haunted Philadelphia for more than 6 decades. Today we give him back his name, Joseph Augustus Zarelli. While we still have work to do, today we restore his humanity." Behind her, the boy's photo, long familiar to anyone who'd ever read about the case, was displayed beside his new name in bold letters. For the first time, the world saw him not as the boy in the box, but as Joseph, a little boy who had lived, laughed, and been loved, if only for a short time. Detectives spoke quietly after the press conference about how surreal it felt. One said, "We used to talk to him like he could hear us, tell him we wouldn't give up. Now it feels like we finally kept that promise." The identification, however, did not end the mystery. It only deepened it. Who killed Joseph? Why was he never reported missing? How could his parents, or anyone in his life, allow his name to vanish from the record? Police have kept some details sealed, citing the sensitivity of surviving family members, but the genealogical data confirmed that Joseph had siblings, some still living though unaware of what had happened to their brother for most of their lives. Imagine learning after decades that your missing sibling was the child in one of America's most famous cold cases. The discovery brought equal parts relief and heartbreak, closure, but not peace. For the detectives and forensic experts who worked the case, the identification marked a victory of persistence, proof that no case is truly unsolvable, no matter how much time passes. For Joseph's extended family, it was a wound reopened, a story they never asked to inherit, but one that now defined part of their history. In the months following the announcement, people visited Joseph Sipp's grave in droves. Some brought flowers, others small toys, letters, or drawings. A few left notes simply reading, "Welcome home, Joseph." His new headstone was placed beside the original, engraved with both his identity and the name the public had given him. Joseph Augustus Zarelli, America Sits Unknown Child. Beneath the carved letters, a new inscription was added, "Finally home." There is something deeply symbolic about that, the merging of both identities, the nameless victim who became a national mystery, and the little boy who once lived and loved in 1950s Philadelphia. Both parts of him now belong to history, united by a name reclaimed through science and perseverance. The case remains open. Police continue to pursue leads, believing that someone, perhaps an elderly relative, perhaps an old neighbor, still carries the truth. DNA gave Joseph back his name. It's up to humanity to give him justice. But in many ways, that 2022 revelation closed the most painful chapter of all. For 6.5 decades, Joseph's existence had been defined by mystery. His grave had been a question mark, and now, for the first time, that question had an answer. The boy in the box was no longer a symbol of the unknown. He was a little boy, Joseph Augustus Zarelli, and at long last the world remembered him. The identification of Joseph Augustus Zarelli closed one of the longest and most haunting chapters in American criminal history. But for the detectives, genealogists, and ordinary people who had carried his story for decades, the end of the mystery wasn't simple closure. It was a moment of reckoning. Because once you finally know his name, you can no longer think of him as the boy in the box. He becomes a real child again. People began to revisit old newspaper articles, online forums, even personal memories, trying to understand how a little boy could vanish from history without a trace. The story wasn't just about solving a crime anymore. It had become about understanding the silence that allowed it to happen. How did a 4-year-old die violently, end up discarded in a cardboard box, and yet no one, not a relative, a neighbor, a teacher, ever come forward to say, "That Sipp's my child. That Sipp's my student. That Sipp's my neighbor Sipp's son"? That's the question that continues to haunt this case. Detectives believe that, at the time, fear and stigma might have silenced those who knew the truth. In the 1950s, child abuse was rarely discussed publicly. The idea of reporting someone within your own family was nearly unthinkable, and Philadelphia's working-class neighborhoods where Joseph lived were tightly knit but also deeply private. Somewhere within that silence, justice slipped away. Over the years, retired officers who once worked the case have spoken about how deeply it affected them. Some kept Joseph's photo pinned to their desks until the day they retired. Others would visit his grave on anniversaries, promising him they'd never give up. One detective described the case as a ghost that follows you home. He said, "You can look at that boy Sipp's face and not feel it. Every time I put my kids to bed, I think of him. Someone Sipp's baby, alone in the cold." And for ordinary citizens, people who had never met Joseph but who adopted his story as part of their own, his identification felt like both a relief and a loss. For 65 years they had known him as America's unknown child. He belonged to everyone, and now he belonged to a family. Yet that sense of collective mourning didn't fade. In fact, it deepened. People began leaving comments online, messages like, "Rest easy, Joseph. You are not forgotten. I hope whoever did this to you is finally found. After all these years, you have your name back. We love you." It was as if the entire nation had adopted him, a boy who never lived long enough to have a voice finally heard by millions. The forensic genealogists who solved the case said that Joseph's identification was one of the most meaningful moments of their careers, not because of fame or headlines, but because it gave back something that should never have been taken, his identity. One of them said in an interview, "People think of DNA as science, but sometimes it sits the closest thing to a resurrection." That line stayed with people, because that's exactly what this was. Not just the solving of a crime, but the revival of a name, a life, a memory. The boy in the box had once symbolized everything tragic about unsolved mysteries. the unknown, the forgotten, the nameless. Now he stood for something entirely different. The power of persistence, compassion, and modern science to right the wrongs of the past. His case has since inspired new funding and renewed efforts in cold case investigations nationwide. Departments that once lacked resources are now turning to genetic genealogy as a lifeline, a way to finally give names back to the countless unidentified victims across America. In Philadelphia, detectives still talk about Joseph as if he sets part of their unit, as if he sets one of their own. They keep his photo in the cold case office, now labeled not just boy in the box but Joseph. One investigator described what it felt like to stand at his grave after the identification, saying, "It sits quiet there, peaceful. For years that grave felt unfinished, a question mark. Now when you stand there, it feels whole, like he sits finally at rest." And maybe that's the real ending. Not the arrest of a suspect or the closing of a file, but the restoration of something more profound. The restoration of humanity. The world now knows Joseph Augustus Zarelli's name. His story, of tragedy, mystery, and rediscovery, reminds us that even in death a life still matters. Even when decades pass, someone somewhere still cares enough to ask, "Who were you?" For 65 years, Joseph was a question. Now he's an answer, proof that persistence can overcome silence, that technology can revive forgotten voices, and that compassion can endure beyond generations. In the end, what we take from this story isn't just the sadness of what happened, it's the strength of those who refuse to give up. The detectives, the volunteers, the strangers who carried his story forward. Because that's what justice really means. Not just punishment, but remembrance. And so when people visit his grave today, they no longer whisper apologies for not knowing his name. They simply say, "Welcome home, Joseph." 65 years after his tiny life was taken, Joseph Augustus Zarelli finally came home. And in that truth, perhaps lies the quiet kind of justice he always deserved. For more than 6 decades, the boy in the box haunted America, a nameless child in a cardboard coffin, a mystery that refused to fade. And now that story finally has a name. Joseph Augustus Zarelli, a little boy whose life ended far too soon, but whose memory has endured through the dedication of strangers, the evolution of science, and the unrelenting pursuit of truth. As we remember him today, we are reminded that behind every cold case file, every photograph, and every line of evidence, there is a human story waiting to be told. Someone sits child, someone sits family, someone sits unanswered why. Even in the darkest mysteries, there are people who refuse to stop searching, people who believe that every name deserves to be spoken, every story deserves to be told, and every life deserves to be remembered. If this story moved you, or if you believe no victim should ever be forgotten, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think really happened to Joseph? And what does his story teach us about justice, empathy, and the passage of time? We read every comment, and your voice helps keep these stories alive. If you want to see more cases like this, both solved and unsolved, make sure to subscribe to the Justice Vault and turn on notifications so you never miss when we reopen another cold case. Because every mystery deserves its day in the light. Thank you for watching. This is the Justice Vault, where the forgotten are remembered and the silent finally speak.